Hello and welcome to Corpus Cast, the podcast all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society and part of the Aston original series. My name is Robbie Love and I'm a lecturer in English language here at Aston University. I'm a corpus linguist, meaning that I study linguistic patterns, trends and variations using large samples of language data. So on behalf of the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group, welcome to the show. In each episode of Corpus Cast, I speak with top researchers in the field to find out more about how corpus linguistics can be applied to a diverse range of areas. Now, in the world of law, the meaning of words is crucial to the legal process. But how do lawyers deal with the fact that language changes over time and the ways in which a reader in the present day may understand centuries-old legal documents differently to how they were perhaps originally intended? How can we be sure of the meaning of a given word as intended when the legal text was originally written? Well, in this episode, our topic is how corpus linguistics contributes to research in the area known as legal interpretation. And we have not one, but two guests joining me for this episode. So to begin with, joining me for our entire conversation in this episode is Professor Ute Römer. Ute Römer is Professor of Applied Linguistics in the Department of Applied Linguistics and English as a Second Language at Georgia State University in the USA. Ute is an applied linguist, and the primary research interests of hers include corpus linguistics, phraseology, usage-based second language acquisition, academic discourse analysis, and the application of corpora in language learning and teaching. Before joining Georgia State University, she was a director of the Applied Corpus Linguistics Unit at the University of Michigan English Language Institute. But it's a relatively recent research interest of Ute's that we'll be speaking about today, using corpus linguistics to better understand legal texts. And so to help us explore this topic, we'll a little bit later be joined by a colleague of Ute, Professor Clark D. Cunningham, and I'll tell you more about him a bit later on. But for now, I'm very pleased to welcome to Corpus Cast Professor Ute Römer. Hello, nice to see you.
Hello, Robbie. Good to see you again, too.
Thank you so much for coming on. I think this is going to be really interesting, the work that you're doing in this area. I want to get straight to it, though, and ask you, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Okay. I feel like this question used to be easier to respond to when I started doing corpus linguistics than it is now. So when I first started working with corpora in the probably late 1990s, to me, it meant doing linguistics with the help of a corpus, defined as a large computerized systematic collection of texts. And it still means that, but I think things have gotten more complicated. So doing it how, with which corpora, which tools, within which theoretical framework, and coming from which disciplinary backgrounds, and so on. So one thing corpus linguistics has always meant to me, and I guess probably will always mean to me, is looking for patterns in collections of language data. In other words, figuring out more about how language is patterned, the patterned nature of language, which is something I love to do, just spotting patterns. And I think what corpora have done is really profoundly change the ways in which we see and describe language, and describe languages through observing what one of my teachers, John Sinclair, called repeated events. And that's something he commented on in his seminal book, Corpus Concordance Collocation, that language looks different when you look at a lot of it at once. And you don't see these patterns emerge unless you have a lot of data. So we need large collections of language data. And then that can be really revealing and really, really powerful. Another thing it means, maybe if I can add one more thing here, is
Go ahead.
Corpus linguistics means that you can increase the level of objectivity in research. And if you gather sufficient corpus evidence, meaning, which is what we're usually after, right? Trying to figure out what something means and what meanings are expressed in the discourse, then meaning is no longer this entirely subjective thing. And then on top of that, of course, to me personally, corpus linguistics means that I get to have a career in something I really enjoy doing. And I'm just really excited to be in this field and be a corpus linguist.
And throughout your career, you have shown, several ways in which corpus linguistics can be applied. And of course, we will soon be talking about one of those areas. But I want to ask you first, you mentioned there how much you enjoy being in this community. How did you first get started in corpus linguistics? What was your journey sort of entering this world?
Sure. Yeah, I already mentioned John Sinclair as an inspiration, but before I got to meet him and learn from him, I first got introduced to corpora by one of my linguistics professors at the University of Cologne in Germany, Wolf Dietrich Bald, who was an applied linguist and a traditional grammarian who had spent some time at the Survey of English Usage in London at UCL. In the 1970s, working with Lord Quirk on a paper-based version of the survey corpus. So he was one of the people typing language examples onto index cards that ended up in large filing cabinets. And I assume he also, which of course, as we know, the survey corpus was later digitized, but I believe he also met the rest of the Fab Four, the Quirk, Greenbaum, Leach, Swartwick. And so he was one of my linguistics professors in Cologne. And for one of the graduate seminars I took with him, the topic was German-English contrastive syntax. I did a corpus analysis of passive constructions in an organic chemistry textbook using the English original and the German translated textbook. And I happened to have the English version because I was also majoring in chemistry. So I did a double, that may be something you didn't know.
I did not know that. That is a shock. That's incredible.
It's a shock. Well, I have a master's degree in English language and literature and one in chemistry.
This is new. This is incredible.
So, and I almost ended up doing a PhD in solid state chemistry because I love patterns so much, even at that time. And that would have been all, looking at crystal structures. And but I couldn't really imagine spending 3 or 4 years of my life in a lab locked away. So that didn't happen. But I think all the analytic skills I picked up during that training come in handy now, as a
and I guess you can see the parallels having studied both, initially.
Exactly. Yeah. So this first analysis was a manual corpus analysis. I actually looked at those two books and compared the English and the German translation and looked at all the passive constructions in this massive volume on organic chemistry. And so I was really excited when Professor Bald got us a copy of the British National Corpus that came with a software program called Sarah. And I no longer had to do this counting things by hand and was able to look at concordances. So my first real corpus analysis was for my MA thesis in 1999 on modal verbs in spoken British English using the BNC, and then in EFL textbooks, kind of figuring out how authentic is the language we present to learners in an EFL setting in a country like Germany. And I presented this study at a wonderful residential seminar, and this is where John Sinclair comes in, at his Tuscan Word Center in Italy in 2000, and got to go there for a second seminar the following year. And honestly, these two trainings probably were the thing that put me on track for a career in corpus linguistics, because I got to study intensively with the first generation of corpus researchers, and I got to meet not just John Sinclair and Elena Tonini Bonelli, who ran the courses, but also some amazing course leaders that John had invited, including Stig Johansson, Guy Aston, Michael Barlow, Anna Marnin, Susan Conrad, the list goes on. And then some of my fellow students, fellow course participants included the next generation, Anne O'Keefe, Fiona Farr, Pascual Perez Paredes, Nadia Nesselhauf. These were all people I met there. So wow. Really formative experience. And in between those two seminars in Tuscany, I spent part of 2001 as a visiting research fellow at the University of Birmingham. So that's where I collected data for my dissertation, and of course got to meet people like Susan Hunston, Wolfgang Teubert. And so, really, really important to be be in the right place at the right time, I guess. And then another thing that really helped were my first few ICAME conferences. I know you and I just got to catch up at ICAME in Cambridge, which I think was the 43rd conference. So I went to one of the 20-something. So at the first one in 2003 in Guernsey, which was my first time meeting all these other wonderful people in our community. So a very intense period of meeting all of these really, well-known and renowned researchers in the field. Definitely, and so supportive. I mean, you've probably experienced that as well in your career, but that's really something I've come to appreciate, that somebody like John Sinclair, opens his training center up and his dining table to us too, and just hangs out with this maybe next generation of corpus researchers. And it turns out he picked some people who are now in professor positions all over the world. I don't know how he did it, but we were all grad students at the time. So
I mean that list of that cohort that you reeled off, it's a real who's who, So amazing that you were all in the same place at the same time at that early part of your career. Mm-hmm. Incredible. There's so much that you've done since then, obviously, and tell me if I'm wrong, but you're probably most active in the area of second language acquisition. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of other stuff you're doing, and we're not actually going to be talking about that in this episode. We're going to be talking about something that I believe has been a bit more of a recent interest of yours, which is looking at language in legal contexts. I had a look at your list of publications, and I saw in 2020 there are a couple of articles that you co-authored in the Georgia State University Law Review, looking at the original meanings of particular words and phrases in quite old American constitutional texts, and picking apart how that sense could be interpreted differently now and the problems that might cause. I guess my question here, before we delve into something you're doing at the moment with Clark, is how did you get into this area? This is seems on the surface a bit of a departure from a lot of the work that you'd been doing until that point.
Yeah. So that was really all pretty serendipitous. I wasn't looking to add projects to my agenda. I had plenty to do with work in the areas you listed: usage-based SLA, learner corpus research, academic writing, and so on. And I wasn't necessarily interested in legal studies. It's an area I honestly didn't know much about, which is a good thing if you want to approach the data without too much bias. Maybe we'll get to that later in our conversation too. I'm still trying to be pretty ignorant about what we interpret and what we find means for litigation and for legal practice. But so one of the GSU Law School professors you mentioned, Clark Cunningham, who's going to join us here, was already connected with one of my colleagues, Eric Frehinel, and who I think was a guest on Corpus.
Yes, we had him on earlier this year talking about aviation English, so another completely different area. Yeah.
Yes. So Eric already knew Clark, and Clark then invited me to serve on a panel. I believe that was in early 2019. For his JD students who were presenting their final papers from a seminar on a course he offered called Linguistic Analysis of Legal Texts. So I sat on the bench in our law school's ceremonial courtroom, like really official, on the bench, asking questions together with two justices, judges, while Clark's students defended the work they did for their course, really defended, because we were like the panel and asking them tricky questions. And I thought, wow, these are some really interesting projects and research questions, and they have real practical relevance for litigation in this country. A judge may listen to these findings or read about them and change her decision in the end, right? So, but I also saw and commented on issues in the law students' research methodology, as well as scope for further development of the linguistics part of these studies, which you know me, I love looking at patterns and phraseology. So usually those suggestions involved looking more at phrases, looking more at constructions rather than just zooming in on what does this word mean, because you really can't tell unless you look at the patterns it occurs in. So they're all looking for meaning, so you need to go beyond the word in isolation. And then this resulted in me joining 2 teams of law and linguistics students as a co-author on the 2 papers you mentioned, that both, I think, started as course papers. And one of the teams also included Clark and Jesse Egbert, professor at Northern Arizona University. And then we presented this work at a law and linguistics workshop later in 2019, and then 2019 published them in the GSU Law Review the following year. And Clark had me back to serve on the bench a few more times, which has inspired additional collaborative work. And I think really it did take, I would not have reached out to anybody in the law school. It did take somebody like Clark to make this happen, and someone who believes that legal scholars alone cannot do this kind of work that we've done in collaboration with each other. So he deserves a lot of the credit here for getting me involved.
Well, he's about to join us to receive that credit. I think it's a good time for me to introduce our other guest in this episode. Professor Clark D. Cunningham is W. Lee Burge Chair in Law and Ethics at the Georgia State University College of Law. Clark started his career as a lawyer before branching out into academia, where he's been responsible for many innovations in the application of social sciences research, including linguistics, to legal context. And as Ute mentioned, Clark has recently been working with her on the applications of corpus linguistics here. So it's a great pleasure. Here he is, ready and waiting to go, to introduce Clark Cunningham to Corpus Cast. Hi, Clark.
Yes. Good day, Robbie. I've enjoyed listening to you and Ute.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you both here together, because you've been working together recently. As Ute mentioned, we recently met at the perhaps best or worst named conference in the world. It's up to you to decide. I came, the International Computer Archive of Modern and Medieval English, I believe, in Cambridge in July, and you together presented a paper entitled Corpus Linguistics Meets the Law. So I guess I want to sort of start with the law bit, and then we'll move on to the linguistics bit. Legal interpretation, what for you are the challenges involved? What does this actually entail?
Well, as a starting position, and this may be interesting to people who, or even surprising to people who don't work inside the law, but in many cases, judges and lawyers start off with the position that the words in a statute or a provision of the Constitution should be interpreted and applied as an ordinary speaker of the language would do so, not with a specialized legal meaning. It's called the plain meaning or ordinary meaning principle. And so if you start with that idea that the first thing you do is ask, how would someone who's not a lawyer, but simply an ordinary speaker of the language, interpret this phrase? Well, then obviously it seems to me that linguists have a lot to contribute to that. My first collaboration with linguists was back in 1994 in an article that was published in the Yale Law Journal called Plain Meaning and Hard Cases. And so it begins with this question. So if the meaning of a phrase in the text is plain, how could there be hard cases, right? Because why wouldn't judges, as competent speakers of the language, quickly agree about the interpretation of the phrase? But hard cases are the kind of cases that go up to a U.S. Supreme Court. And what typically has happened is two lower courts have looked at exactly the same text and come up with often diametrically different interpretations. And yet both lower courts say, we're just interpreting it according to ordinary meaning. So what's going on? Are they engaged in some kind of intellectual dishonesty? Is one of them able to understand English and the other one isn't? What's going on? So that was kind of the question we posed for this article, Plain Meaning in Hard Cases. And I collaborated with three American linguists, Judith Levy, who I think at the time was the chair of the Northwestern Linguistics Department, Georgia Green at the University of Illinois, and Jeffrey Kaplan out in San Diego. And we did a little experiment. I picked 4 cases that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to decide later that year. And and in each of the cases, the lower courts had disagreed, but said it was ordinary meaning or plain meaning. So I gave them to the team and said, go to work. And the Yale Law Journal agreed to rush our analysis into galleys. And we sent the galleys to the U.S. Supreme Court before they heard oral argument on the cases. And it was a spectacular success. In 2 of the 3 cases, the U.S. Supreme Court cited our analysis. It was really wonderful. And what happened is that the linguists were very good at figuring out that typically there was a kind of not apparent ambiguity in the text, and that one lower court was selecting meaning A, and the other court was selecting meaning B. And so they were, in a sense, both correct, but unaware that there was an ambiguity that was causing that separation. The linguists were able both to disclose the ambiguity and then give some guidance about, given the context, which you would appreciate, which of those possible different meanings was appropriate in the context. So that's how I got started. And that's still a central issue is, given the starting position that lawyers and judges want to know how a phrase is going to be interpreted in ordinary meaning, linguists are helpful. More recently, the work that Ute and I have been doing has tended to focus on the text of the U.S. Constitution, which is over 200 years old. And so we're looking at what would the ordinary meaning be of the constitutional text back in the late 18th century. And that, of course, is something that Corpus Linguistics is an incredible and almost unique resource for. And what we've now done a number of these projects, both with Jesse Egbert and with Ute, and we're pretty consistently finding that modern-day judges and lawyers are failing to appreciate that the meaning of the word in the text 200 plus years ago was probably used differently than today. So, for example, the paper that we presented in Cambridge, the word misdemeanor was used pretty clearly, very differently 200 plus years ago than it is today. And yet the legal scholars writing about this don't seem to have thought about that possibility.
So you mentioned that paper. I think that's a good point to talk more about that. Ute, would you be able to tell us more about the paper that you presented with Clark from your perspective, and how corpus linguistics helped you to navigate this area of the meaning of misdemeanor?
Yeah, sure. And Clark may be able to fill in some of the things because it was a pretty comprehensive analysis, and we've been working on it for a couple of years now. So the title, as you mentioned, was of the paper at Cambridge was Corpus Linguistics Meets the Law. And the subtitle was a question, namely, can an American president only be impeached for criminal conduct? So what we used corpus methods and linguistic interpretation for in this case was shedding light on the meaning of misdemeanors in the U.S. Constitution's impeachment clause. And in this clause, it says that the president, paraphrasing, shall be removed from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That is the crucial phrase there, right? So during the first Senate impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump in early 2020, Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor, argued on behalf of Trump that the words crimes and misdemeanors in the Constitution are essentially synonymous terms. And therefore, the charges against Trump should be dismissed without a Senate trial because the conduct, the alleged conduct, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress were not considered crimes. So, but were they misdemeanors, right? Certainly not on how we understand the word misdemeanor today, right? Those are usually minor felonies like a DUI or a traffic offense or something. That would be a misdemeanor. But what did misdemeanor mean to the founding fathers during the founding era, right, 200 years ago? Because that was what's in the Constitution. So we need to go with the meaning it had back then, not now. So what we did, this whole controversy, and part of it was also that scholars would argue that it's a fixed term, like a legal term of art, high crimes and misdemeanors, and the meaning is determined on a case-by-case basis. So we don't really need to figure out what misdemeanor means here because it's part of this fixed phrase, right? So that prompted us to ask that question: what counted as a misdemeanor in the founding era American English? And we did that with a huge, pretty big corpus of about 67 million words. We downloaded over 180,000 texts from a website called Founders Online. It's an excellent resource for people interested in historical American English. Contains papers of early American leaders, including the founders, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and so on. And we covered a time span of early 18th century, 1706, I think, to 1830s. And then essentially looked at misdemeanor and crimes, misdemeanors, and the context those words occurred in systematically as a corpus linguist would, using all the steps and all of the analytic techniques that we normally apply, like concordances, collocation lists, dispersion plots, engram, extraction, clusters, things like that, to get at, well, how was misdemeanor used during that time? So some of the things we found was that this phrase in the Constitution was not a fixed idiom. There are plenty of variations. So high crimes and misdemeanors is not fixed, right? We also found that based on what we see in our data sets, looking at hundreds of examples of misdemeanor in context, that crime and misdemeanor were not synonymous. They did not mean the same thing. Very different collocational preferences as you would see in just using a simple tool like entconc. And then we were interested in the scope of the modifiers, other and high, to see, do they just modify crime, or so is it other high crimes and all sorts of misdemeanors, or is it other high crimes and other high misdemeanors? So in order to get at that, I used my construction grammar toolbox and looked at other noun and noun constructions systematically, and high noun and noun constructions. And in the majority of cases, those two modifiers have a scope over both nouns in that construction. So we can argue that to the founders, they would have understood this phrase, this part of the impeachment clause, to mean other high crimes and other high misdemeanors. So then we were like, well, what are high misdemeanors? What counted as a high misdemeanor, right, at that time? So we found, and that's not a phrase that you find nowadays at all. It essentially disappeared, completely gone. And we looked at historical corpus data for that. So not relevant anymore, which makes sense. If you think of what misdemeanor means, what would a high misdemeanor be? Like a really bad DUI, or what would that doesn't really make sense. So clearly there must have been some semantic shift there, but we wanted to know what high misdemeanor was during the founding era and what it related to, and also looked at that as different from misdemeanor used in other contexts. So a high misdemeanor is a specific type of offense. One thing I found interesting in this context was that there are some repeated constructions in which misdemeanor occurs together with the word other. And so in constructions like noun, and other misdemeanors. So misdemeanor really like used as a catch-all term at the end of a list. And then the list before it included pretty severe felonies like treason or murder. Those were types of misdemeanors, right, in this usage. And then on high misdemeanor, Clark looked at a lot of data sources in a more qualitative way to get at the meaning of, so what was a high misdemeanor, and found that it relates to conduct affecting government, to attacking governmental authority, abuse of power, things like that. So in the end, it's different from what a high misdemeanor in founding era America, at least. High misdemeanors could be very different than high crimes. And they did refer to abuse of power and obstruction of government, essentially the charges brought against former President Trump.
Wow. So really a big difference. And maybe, Clark, you could comment on this and maybe other cases you've been involved with where you do show that there's a difference in the original interpretation or the intended meaning and how people might interpret it. Now, how is this sort of linguistic analysis received among lawyers and legal scholars, basically saying, language change is actually really relevant here and you have to pay attention to it? Do they accept that readily, or is there any resistance to this sort of work?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, I would say. There's been, in the last 3 or 4 years, a real surge of interest in what lawyers and judges and academics call corpus linguistics. It's now kind of a catchphrase. So if you, there's a website that I maintain on law and linguistics, and you'll see over 40 articles in the past 5 years that are basically about corpus linguistics that appear in all kinds of top research university law journals. Unfortunately, most of them are not co-authored with linguists. And as a result, there's a lot of enthusiasm, but often a little bit on the misguided side, or a simplistic approach to applying corpus linguistics, not a sensitivity to the importance of phraseology, which is something I've learned especially to appreciate working with Ute. But nonetheless, that's significant. In addition, we've had 4 state Supreme Courts that have actually cited and used corpus linguistics, again, unfortunately, without guidance from professional linguists, but they're in there. We've had 2 federal courts of appeals actually ask for briefing on corpus linguistics, and Ute and I responded to one of those and submitted a friend of the court brief. It was one of the first things we worked on, and that turned into an article. So that I think it's generally a positive story. Probably the most successful impact in terms of the work of courts is really the first big project I did with Jesse Egbert at Northern Arizona University, once again involving former President Trump, who seems to be good at generating interesting legal questions. And it was a very famous set of lawsuits filed soon after he became president, having to do with the fact he would not give up ownership of the Trump International Hotel in D.C., which is a short distance from the White House. He continued to own it through his corporation or organization, and not surprisingly, everybody wanted to stay at the Trump International Hotel, and there were lawsuits brought that his continuing to collect profits from that hotel violated something in the U.S. Constitution that prohibits receiving emoluments from foreign governments. Well, like high misdemeanor, only more so, emolument is a word that's just disappeared from contemporary English. Nobody uses it. Nobody has any speaker intuition about it. And so Jesse Egbert and I started on that project, actually having met at a corpus linguistics conference that the Georgia State Applied Linguistics Department was hosting. That's how I met him. And we first just worked out as a pure research project. We knew there was this controversy out there. We thought, what a good opportunity to try to persuade the legal world that corpus linguistics was useful, to pick a word that nobody understood anymore, but was consequential. We ended up doing two friend of the court briefs. And in one of the big cases that we ended up being cited by the court as evidence that the word could not be interpreted as narrowly as President Trump's lawyers intended it for it to be interpreted. However, it took so long for that case to work forward that President Trump appealed it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then he didn't get reelected. So the case went away. That was that's the clearest impact that this work has had. There is a challenge, which is that lawyers and judges and law professors already think they're experts at interpreting language. It's what we do. And so particularly, I think we've encountered with law professors some resistance to this methodology for, I think, at least two reasons. One is it is a little threatening to them to think, wait a minute, do I need to bring in another discipline to tell me how what I've been doing all along and improve? The other is a somewhat ideological or political, and that is that because this work goes back 200 years to ask how the language would have been understood 200 years ago, it gets caught up in what's a political fight in the United States that's sort of called originalism, about how important should the original meaning of the Constitution be versus its contemporary application. We keep saying that we really, as they say in the South, don't have a dog in that fight. That's a second question, which is a decision to be made as a matter of policy. But to the extent to which judges say a starting point is what did the word mean at the time, then we have something to say and contribute. The courts can then accept it, as in the case of a monument, say, okay, that's how it would have been used then, but we're going to apply it in a different way. That's not a problem for us as an interdisciplinary research team. But no, I'm very excited about the one thing we haven't talked too much about is that Ute mentioned this course that I've developed called Linguistic Analysis of Legal Texts, which is deliberately interdisciplinary. So I employ graduate students from Ute's department as teaching assistants and mentors for my students, because again, I want to model that this has to be done in a collaborative way. And students from that course have co-authored a number of articles, including with me and Ute. They've co-authored a couple of Friends of the Court briefs. And this year, they've been accepted as presenters. So at the upcoming next month, the American Association of Corpus Linguistics, in addition to Ute and myself, several of my students are going to be independently presenting, having their papers developed for my course accepted through a blind review process. So that's very exciting. And the students are really excited about this work. They really are.
So there's this sort of new crop of students are very receptive to corpus linguistics methods, and they are persuaded, I suppose, by this combination. We can chat more about that in a moment. I want to go back for a second, though. You said about how a lot of this work is taking place in the course without a linguist. But of course, you are working with Ute and others. You mentioned Jesse Egbert as well. Ute, from your side of things, this is doing interdisciplinary work is not new to you, but this particular type of interdisciplinary work is something a little bit different. What about from your side, the process of co-authoring research of this nature? What are the challenges and I hope also the joys of this sort of work?
Yeah, certainly both, I would say. And as you mentioned, this is not the first time I'm working with scholars from other fields. I've worked on collaborative projects with colleagues from psychology, computer science, music theory, a jazz music analysis.
Oh yeah,
which maybe if we have time, I'll share a little bit about that. Now legal studies, and I think one obvious challenge, but also at the same time a massive opportunity, is that you have very different backgrounds and bring different experiences, expectations, different skill sets to the table. So it's really important to, as you start that collaboration, to not assume that the other scholar knows what your work really focuses on, and at the same time to not think that you know what they are doing and what they know, right? So you need to communicate well. You need to be explicit about the methods and the concept you're applying. I always ask lots of questions. We figure out the research questions together. So without that guidance, so what are we trying to address here? I don't know what to do in terms of what to look at in a corpus. So I still stick to what I know and what I'm trained to do. And at the same time, I appreciate what the other scholar brings to the table. And because I know I wouldn't be able to do this specific work, whatever it is, without Clark, he likely wouldn't be able to do this type of analysis without a linguist like me. So I could not have published papers in a law review or in a jazz education journal by myself without collaborators. So I've learned that language pattern analysis can provide answers to questions that are not related to linguistics, and also that in the case of this jazz analysis, language may not just consist of words, but it could be a sequence of interval changes in a jazz solo, for instance. In terms of joys, I think I learn a lot, and I see the practical value of what I know and what I do for other disciplines. So contributing to solving problems that are not linguistics or language acquisition problems outside of my field is really fun. And you learn that, other fields need linguists. Everybody needs a linguist. Everybody who works with language in some way, right?
That's a good motto. I like that. Clark, what about you then from your side? This particular collaboration with Ute is producing really interesting research. You've been joining up and sharing students and training, and you said that you've got some students presenting at conferences. Presumably, you're really pleased with how this interdisciplinary work is going.
Well, it's great fun, and there's a wonderful amount of intellectual discovery, which interdisciplinary work is my favorite kind of scholarship. And as you mentioned, outside of linguists, I've done other kinds of interdisciplinary work with social scientists, but this is certainly my favorite. I think what's happened is over and over again, we start the methodology is, and this is how I ask my students, they start with a legal issue which is interesting, that may be consequential. Like, can a president be impeached only for criminal conduct? That's a legal question, right? And then they work with a linguist to try to come up with a research question that could illuminate the legal issue, but is amenable to research. And that's a new idea for law students. And that's probably the hardest thing for them to do. And often what happens is the research question ends up being the wrong question. And we work on it for a while and then reframe it, which is, of course, the empirical methodology. So the biggest project Ute and I worked on, which was this meaning of cases. I still it's a finding that I'm trying to proselytize, but the word cases in the part of the Constitution that creates the power of the courts always, including me, I thought it was a piece of litigation, something that happens in a courtroom, right? And so we went to the research problem started off that way, and then it just the results were just very hard to sort, categorize stuff, and we start finding very peculiar things, and it was really then there was a multi-step process. But what we got to the point of Ute and one of her PhD students, Sally Wren, said, "Well, wait a minute, maybe case is a shell noun." And I didn't know what a shell noun was. But they said, so that it doesn't bring to the context something that means a piece of litigation. And so I'm now quite persuaded that that's a plausible and probably the best interpretation of that provision. And if that's right, it would be transformative to American legal theory. And it just, could possibly happen without the degree of collaboration. So this is just my favorite thing to do. As an academic, there are other things that are favorite things to do.
Absolutely. Well, Clark, thank you so much for joining us. We'll briefly say goodbye to you as we wrap up the episode with a few quick questions on corpus linguistics for Ute, and we'll see you again in a few moments to wrap things up. Ute, thank you so much. This has been so interesting so far, and your collaboration with Clark is really remarkable, because not only is it, making a contribution to research, but also feeding directly to your students' programs and their training and development as well, which is really inspirational, I think. I want to finish the episode by asking you some quick questions, which may or may not have quick answers. We'll find out. First of all, what is the biggest change that you've noticed in corpus research throughout your career?
Some keywords that come to mind, I think, are growth and diversification. There's certainly everything's getting more sophisticated and bigger, including the data sources we have access to. When I was working on my PhD, having 10 million words of spoken transcribed speech was amazing, right? 100 million word British national corpus. Wow. Now we have billions of words that we can extract patterns from. So that's different. And also increasing interdisciplinarity, methodological sophistication and diversification, growth in the areas of application as well. I did a plenary at last year's AAAL, the American Applied Linguistics Association conference. And as I was preparing for that, I wanted to look at applied corpus linguistics and looked through all the papers in all of the, I think, 22 strands at the conference. And 20 of these strands had papers in them that mentioned corpora in their abstracts. So it's in so many areas in our field now, and beyond our field, as this episode has shown, I think. Those are some of the things I would mention as changes.
And what about the biggest misconception of corpus linguistics that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think we all have a funny story, like something a student associated with it, but I will also have a more serious answer to that. So I had a student once who, when I asked a group of undergraduate students what they thought corpus linguistic was, guessed that it was the study of dead languages, because I think he thought of a corpse, a dead body. So that clearly wasn't what I was looking at.
Yeah.
But more seriously, I think a common misconception of corpus linguistics is that it is just about using the tools and the data sets. That you don't need, it's absent of any linguistic or other theory. And that I find really problematic, because just being able to retrieve a concordance from COCA or a list of collocations from any online corpus doesn't make you a corpus linguist or a corpus researcher. And relating to the legal studies, interdisciplinary work, I think that's one danger of putting corpora in the hands of legal scholars, of lawyers and judges who figure out how to, within an hour workshop, figure out how to use one of these online tools. And then also, as Clark mentioned, they work with Llanguage all day long, but they're not trained linguists. So it's really easy to, maybe coming back to one of my teachers, John Sinclair, who warned us, right? A corpus is not a simple object. It's really easy to derive nonsensical conclusions from the evidence you're looking at, just as easy as it is to derive insightful ones. And so if you don't have that background of linguistic terminology and theories, and your searches are not motivated and linguistically interpretable, you're in trouble. So that is a major, I think, misconception, that all you need to do is learn how to use AntConc or learn how to go to COCA, but usually, and I think what Clark said really illustrated that really well with the cases study, until we looked at the data together and the linguists on the team realized, well, cases on its own, it doesn't mean anything. It inherits its meaning from the words it co-occurs with. And it's a general noun, it's a shell noun, until we had that application of our linguistic theory knowledge, we couldn't really make sense of the data. So I think that's kind of an important thing to remember.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to finish up, I'm going to throw our producer Sam a bit of a curveball on the fly. So I'm not going to ask the usual final quick question that I do. I'm going to make up one just for you, Ute, which is, what on earth if you could briefly, this might not be possible, but what on earth does corpus linguistics have to do with jazz music?
Okay, so I already hinted at that. It's looking for patterns in a data set doesn't always have to be language in terms of, well, let me rephrase that. It's language, but doesn't consist of words necessarily, right?
There you go. You've even got the question up on the screen. Very good. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, perfect. So the language of interest in this study was music, and more specifically, jazz improvisation by experts like Charlie Parker and his, that generation of jazz musicians. So what this project aimed to uncover were central aspects of jazz improvisation. And I worked with another GSU professor in the School of Music, Martin Norgaard, and he had a corpus. He had a corpus of jazz solos in which there were no words, but the pitches, so the interval changes, were converted into intervals represented as positive or negative numbers of half-step changes. So imagine you have a sequence, the text is a sequence of numbers preceded with minuses sometimes if the interval step went down. So you'd have 1, 1, 1, 1, -2, 3, -1, +7 if somebody jumps up, right? So with the help of a tool, corpus analysis tool, basic analytic techniques, we used AntConc on a corpus of, I think about 450 solos from a database called the Weimar Jazz Database. We showed that patterns are really ubiquitous in jazz improvisation, and we highlighted the central role of those patterns in real-time music creation, because when you improvise, you can't really you don't plan, but you fall back on memorized patterns. And some jazz musicians are better at that than others. So it was, and this paper just came out this year in a jazz education journal, I think, called Jazz Education in Theory and Practice. So pattern extraction from jazz music is possible.
That is
AntConc does not care if you're throwing it at sequences of letters or sequences of minuses and numbers. So as long as there's pattern recognition and you can make sense of them, of course, that's when I need the music professor, right? Because I don't know what they mean. But he was impressed that how long these patterns were, that in improvisation with no sheet music in front of you, that were recurring multiple times in expert jazz musicians' production.
Well, thank you for satisfying my curiosity. I had to ask because I was so amazed when I saw this sort of new combination of disciplines. So thank you. That sounds incredible. I can't wait to read the paper. Okay, we will bring things to a close now. Back to the legal interpretation topic. Thank you, Clark, for being patient with us, chatting about jazz music there. It's really interesting. I want to thank you both for joining us for this episode of Corpus Cast. This has been really fun, really interesting, and it's incredible the work that you're achieving together. And of course, I want to thank you, the viewers and listeners of the show. Thank you for joining us, however you've accessed us, whether that's on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, or Podchaser. Do let us know your thoughts about this and other episodes using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on Twitter at Aston Corpus. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast written and hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. So thanks again, and thank you to Ute Römer and Clark Cunningham from Georgia State University. It's been a pleasure to speak to you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie. This was fun.
Yes.